Ever feel like you're trying to translate ancient Greek when all you want to do is get your audio from Resolve over to Pro Tools?
Ah, the eternal struggle for smooth audio post-production workflows.
Well, today we are diving deep into the world of AAF. Exporting our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to demystify the process and equip you with all the intel you need to make that audio handover as painless as possible.
Think of us as your trusty guides through the AAF jungle. We've got maps, compasses, even some insider tips from the developers themselves.
Ooh, insider tips. Sounds juicy.
Oh, there are definitely some interesting stories behind certain design choices, but we'll get to those.
Okay, you've got my attention. So where do we even start with this whole AAF business? Is it just me, or does the term itself sound kind of intimidating?
It can definitely sound like we're getting into the weeds, but at its core, an AAF is basically just a way of packaging up all your audio information in a format that another program, like Pro Tools in our case, can understand.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like a universal language for audio editors.
You got it. And just like with any language, there can be dialects and nuances.
Oh, so that's where all the compatibility issues come in.
Exactly. Which brings us to one of the first things you always want to double check. Which versions of Resolve and Pro Tools are you using? Because things get a whole lot smoother if you're working with Resolve 16 or later.
Let me guess, they made some improvements?
You could say that. Resolve 16 and beyond have a much more Pro Tools-friendly AAF export. Before that, it was a bit like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Been there, tried that, ended up with a very sad-looking peg. But I'm guessing there are people out there who might be working with older setups. What if you can't upgrade just yet? Are you doomed?
Not doomed, just a bit more cautious. Always, and I mean always, double-check the compatibility notes in Resolve's documentation. It'll save you a world of headaches down the line.
Good to know. So, we've got our software version sorted. What's next on our AAF checklist?
This is where one of my favorite features comes in the Pro Tools preset in Resolve's export settings.
Ooh, a preset just for Pro Tools. Sounds promising.
It's like having a secret weapon. This preset configures everything to be perfectly aligned with how Pro Tools likes to receive its AAF files.
Okay, that makes sense. But why even bother with a separate preset? Can't we just use the regular export AAF/XML option?
You could, and it might even work sometimes. But that general export uses a broader AAF standard, which means it's trying to be all things to all software.
Ah, so it's like the difference between ordering a specific dish off a menu and just asking the chef to make you something good?
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
With the general export, there's a higher chance Pro Tools might misinterpret something or get a bit confused about how to handle certain elements.
And we want to avoid confusion at all costs. Pro Tools preset it is. So we've got that checked off. What's the next step in our AAF adventure?
Now we get to make a choice.
Hmm.
It's time to decide between an embedded AAF or a referenced AAF.
Ooh, decisions. Okay, break it down for me. What are the pros and cons of each? Okay, so we're choosing our AAF adventure path, embedded or referenced. Is it a matter of one being better, or is it more about which playstyle suits you best?
Exactly. It all comes down to how you like to work and what your project demands. Think of embedded AAF like packing a suitcase. You put everything you need. Clothes, toiletries, your lucky audio editing pen, all in one neat little package.
Convenient, especially when you're dealing with airport baggage handlers or, sending files off to collaborators.
Precisely. But, and here's where the analogy maybe breaks down a little. If you suddenly realize you need to swap out your socks, you have to unpack the entire suitcase.
Okay, so maybe not ideal if you're prone to last-minute audio tweaks.
Exactly. And that's where referenced AAF swoops in, like a well-organized toolkit. Everything has its place, neatly labeled and ready to go.
So more organization, but also more flexibility if you need to make changes.
You got it. The trade-off is you do need to make sure you keep track of all those separate files. If you move something accidentally, Pro Tools won't know where to find it.
Makes sense. Organization is key. Speaking of which, let's talk about something that always makes me feel like I'm organizing a digital flea market metadata. What's the deal with this whole data about data thing, and why should I even care?
I hear you. Metadata can seem a bit like a chore, but trust me, it's your best friend when it comes to keeping your sanity, especially on larger projects. Imagine opening up your Pro Tools session and all your clips are just labeled like Audio 1, Audio 2.
Chills. Just thinking about it gives me flashbacks to some of my early editing days. Let's just say I'm very well acquainted with the find and replace function.
I feel your pain. That's why metadata is so crucial. When you enable embedded source clip metadata in Resolve, you're essentially giving each clip its own little ID card with all its vital information.
So instead of audio 47, I've got scene 3 spaceship explosion final take.
Exactly. And Pro Tools will thank you for it because it can then organize and label everything accordingly.
Happy Pro Tools, happy life. Now let's dive into the nitty-gritty of the actual audio files themselves. We've got mono versus poly WAs. Which one should we befriend for a smooth AAF journey?
This one's easy. Pro Tools absolutely adores monofiles. It's all about giving each channel its own dedicated space.
So instead of trying to cram all the audio into one lane, we're giving each instrument, each sound effect, its own highway to travel down.
You've got it. Less traffic, fewer collisions, smoother ride all around.
Love it. Now, let's talk about something that seems simple, but can actually cause a lot of confusion: muted versus disabled clips. Is silence not just silence in the world of AAF?
You'd be surprised. Here's the thing. Muted clips in Resolve, even though they're silent, they still get included when you export your AAF.
Wait, really? That seems counterintuitive.
It's a common gotcha
Yeah.
and can lead to a lot of head scratching down the line. Disabled clips, on the other hand, those are completely left out, which is what we want if we're going for a clean, streamlined AAF.
So muted clips are like those phantom phone vibrations. You think something's there, but it's not actually doing anything. And disabled clips are like turning your phone off, completely blissful silence.
I like that analogy. And to make absolutely sure our AAF is as silent as we need it to be, here's a little pro tip. Before you export, duplicate your Resolve project and then go through that duplicate and delete any muted or disabled clips you don't absolutely need.
Housekeeping for a happy AAF. I can get behind that. Now, I've heard whispers something called handles. Are we talking about those little grabby things you attach to a coffee mug?
Not quite, although I wouldn't say no to a coffee mug handle right about now. In the audio world, handles are those extra frames you add to the beginning and end of your clips. Think of it like leaving yourself a little wiggle room.
Wiggle room essential for any creative endeavor, I'd say. So how much wiggle room are we talking here?
A good starting point is 6 to 10 frames of handles. And remember, we're talking frames here, not seconds. It's a small detail, but it can make a world of difference.
Details matter, especially when it comes to AAF. So we've got our handle set. What's next on our AAF checklist?
The age-old question, to video or not to video. That is what we shall ponder next.
All right, so we're picking up our AAF saga with the big question video: to include or not to include. Feels like a Shakespearean dilemma.
Well, it's definitely one of those decisions where there's no one-size-fits-all answer. It really depends on the project and your own workflow.
Okay, so walk me through the options here. When would I want to include video in my AAF, and when would I be better off leaving it out?
Let's start with the leave it out scenario. This is often the simplest and most straightforward approach, especially for projects where the audio is fairly self-contained. Think voiceovers, music editing, that sort of thing. You can just export the AAF with your audio tracks and then send a separate guide mix to your audio engineer.
Guide mix being.
Basically, just a version of your video with all the audio levels balanced the way you like them. It gives the audio engineer a reference point for the overall feel and pacing of the project.
Okay, so it's like providing a map of the sonic landscape, even if they're not working directly with the visuals.
Precisely. But of course, there are times when you absolutely need to see the video to do the audio justice. If you're working on something with complex sound design, lots of sound effects sync to specific actions, you'll want to embed a reference video in your AAF.
So they can see exactly when that spaceship explodes in all its glory.
Exactly. It allows for a much tighter integration of sound and visuals.
Okay, so we've got our video situation figured out. But let's be real, sometimes even with the best laid plans, things can still go sideways. What are some common AAF hiccups we should be prepared for, and how do we fix them?
It's, troubleshooting time. It wouldn't be a true deep dive without it. One of the common and frustrating issues you might encounter is audio drift.
Okay, I've heard horror stories about audio drift. For those of us who haven't experienced it firsthand, what does it actually sound like?
Imagine you're watching a movie, and the dialogue starts out perfectly in sync, but then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the words start to drift out of sync with the actors' mouths. It's enough to drive you absolutely crazy.
Okay, yeah, that sounds pretty awful. What causes that to happen in an AAF handover?
9 times out of 10, it comes down to how Resolve and Pro Tools handle frame boundaries. You see, even if things look perfectly lined in your Resolve timeline, if a clip is even a fraction of a frame off, it can create a tiny discrepancy. And those tiny discrepancies, they add up over time and create that dreaded audio drift.
It's like a sonic domino effect. So how do we prevent those dominoes from falling?
The good news is that Resolve has a handy setting that can help align audio edits to frame boundaries. Enabling this will ensure that all your clips snap to those frame boundaries with absolute precision.
Like a safety net for our audio.
Exactly. But let's say, hypothetically speaking, you've enabled all the settings, you've done everything by the book, and you're still running into issues. What then?
Do we panic?
No need for panic. This is where knowing your alternative workflows comes in handy. Sometimes a change of scenery is all you need to break through those technical barriers. One option is to use Adobe Premiere Pro as a go-between.
Wait, really bringing another software into the mix?
Hear me out. You export an XML from Resolve, import that into Premiere, and then export your final AAF from Premiere. For whatever reason, sometimes this roundabout route just works.
It's like taking a scenic detour when the main highway is under construction.
Exactly. And if Premiere isn't your cup of tea, there's always Avid Media Composer. Again, it might seem counterintuitive to bring in a third software, but Media Composer has its own unique way of handling AAF that might just save the day.
So the key takeaway here is don't be afraid to experiment.
Exactly. The world of audio post-production is all about finding what works best for you and your workflow. Sometimes the most unconventional approach can lead to the smoothest results.
Words to live by. And on that note, we've reached the end of our AAF Odyssey. Any parting words of wisdom for our listeners before they venture out into the wild world of audio post-production?
Just this. Armed with the knowledge you've gained today, go forth and conquer those AAF exports. And remember, every audio pro has been in your shoes at some point. We're all just figuring it out as we go. Don't be afraid to experiment. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And most importantly, don't be afraid to embrace the occasional happy accident.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll bid you farewell. Happy editing, everyone.